Hello everyone and welcome to the FIA and Ai Palette webinar, Conscious Consumption in a Post-COVID-19 Normal China. This is the first webinar of a three-part series, so please keep a lookout for upcoming webinars on ASEAN and India in the following weeks. My name is May and I'm from Food Industry Asia. Before we begin, I'll just like to share with you the format of today's session. It will be 30 minutes of presentation by our speaker, followed up by 20 minutes of Q&A. And if you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them in the chat box at the right side of your screen and we'll address it during the Q&A segment. All attendees will be muted for the entire session and the webinar will be recorded. I'd like to introduce you to our speaker for the day, Salome, who is the Head of Innovation and Insights at AI Palette. Salome, please.
Thanks for that introduction, May, and thank you to everybody joining us today. It's been a few months since China has opened up since the COVID-19 pandemic first broke out, and consumers have gotten accustomed to this new normal. So what we've done at AI Palette is that we, in collaboration with Food Industry Asia, have used artificial intelligence to see which patterns and behaviors which have emerged in the context of COVID-19 have actually stuck and had a lasting impact. We'll also see how stakeholders in the food and beverage space are responding to these changes in behavior. Overall, what we see is that as life has gone back to normal in China, consumers are becoming more deliberate about their food choices. And we see this overarching theme of conscious consumption play out in different categories in the food and beverage space. And that's what we want to take you through today. I'll start by telling you a little bit about AI Palette for those of you joining us for the first time. I'll also walk you through the approach and the methodology that we use. Then we look at how the drivers and motivations have shifted and evolved during the COVID-19 pandemic in China. And we'll also see how these drivers are impacting product categories and which categories are growing and declining. Finally, we'll cover some patterns and opportunities which have emerged in the F&B space. And lastly, we'll end with a regional analysis because, of course, there's a lot of diversity within the broader China market. With that, I'll dive straight in. A brief introduction about myself. I'm the Head of Innovation and Insights at AI Palette, and I come with a background in brand management, having worked in multiple markets across Asia and the US as well. So AI Palette is a Singapore-based deep technology startup. We're actually backed by the government of Singapore. And we use artificial intelligence and machine learning to work with consumer goods companies and other companies in the food and beverage space to help them identify and predict trends in near real time. Let me next walk you through what makes our approach and methodology unique. So firstly, we train our data on food and beverage specific data. So what that means is that our patented algorithm is trained on data which is specific to food and beverages. The reason that is important is because the context in which consumers use language when it comes to food and beverages can be quite unique. For example, the word chili, the word hot, when used in the context of food, typically means something which is rich in chili and which is spicy and not referring to the temperature. So, which is why we train our algorithm on food and beverage specific data. Next, for every market that we analyze, we look at the sources which are local and relevant to that market. And lastly, our algorithm is language agnostic. It is trained to understand multiple non-English languages. So for today's analysis, we'll be using the algorithm's ability to analyze Mandarin. Let's look at the data sources next that we have taken into account for this analysis. So we've looked at the most popular social media sources in the Chinese market, the microblogging website Sina Weibo. We've also looked at search engine data from Baidu, as well as retail product data from multiple e-commerce channels like Taobao, Tmall, and JD. And overall, we've analyzed a total of 562 million consumer data points over the time period from January of 2019 up until July of 2020. We've broken this into three periods. The 2019 data helps us establish a baseline. And then even in the 2020 data, we've broken it down into the first wave, which is the first 3 months of the year from Jan to March, and then the second wave of the COVID-19 pandemic from April to July. So the methodology that we use is that firstly, we start by identifying the local and relevant data sources. And we work to then collect all this data. The good news is that this data is available to us even during tricky times like lockdown and social distancing. And actually, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the amount of data on social media actually went up significantly. Then we work to analyze this data with the help of our language agnostic proprietary AI algorithm to identify any changes in behavior and patterns. For this analysis, we'll be focusing on which of those changes in behavior have stuck as the COVID-19 pandemic has progressed in the China market. So firstly, let's look at how the drivers and motivations are have shifted in the China market and how they are influencing consumer decisions. So overall, what we see is that yes, health and taste still are very key drivers when it comes to consumer preferences and decisions, but there has been a shift in the drivers as well. At the start of the pandemic, when there was a lot of panic buying and stockpiling, the important drivers were much more utilitarian. So consumers, for instance, were concerned about food wastage, packaging, such as size and shelf life, as well as distribution and channel preference and availability overall. So the drivers have shifted from those more utilitarian drivers to now consumers are more seeking convenience. At the same time, they're being more mindful and conscious about their decisions. We see key drivers like ease of preparation, and consumers are seeking food which is easy to prepare. At the same time, they also are looking for food which is nourishing and natural. And we'll actually go into each and every one of these drivers to see how they have manifested themselves in the China market. Let's first dig into the driver of health. So overall, health continues to be a very key driver in the China market. And we analyzed 137 million consumer data points, which talk about health in different forms. But going deeper into the broader topic of health, while immunity is still very important to the Chinese consumers, they are also seeking more wholesome nutrition. What we mean by that is that they're also looking for products which are suitable for specific diets, which provide energy, and which are rich in protein, among other things. So there overall there has been, in addition to immunity, now consumers are also seeking more wholesome nutrition. This has manifested itself in different product categories in the China market. So we see many different brands launching products on e-commerce, which are tapping into this overarching need for wholesome nutrition. On one hand, Mido, which is a sports drink brand, has launched a green grape and bamboo flavor, and they're not only tapping into the need for immunity and vitamin C, but also the other functional needs like low in sugar and rich in fiber. So they're tapping into this overarching theme for wholesome nutrition. We also have other products like Mr. Jiasu, which has launched a red bean barley drink, and this drink is catering to those consumers who are looking for options which are zero calories, zero fat, and also seeking plant-based drinks as well. If you look at the snacks category, this need for functional attributes of products has manifested itself. For instance, let me take the example of Xiaodai number 9, which has launched multiple shredded soy products in many different flavors on e-commerce channels. Next, let's go into the second driver of taste. So here what we see is that firstly, the COVID-19 pandemic has definitely made chefs out of a lot of people. On one hand, you have home chefs who are cooking more and experimenting more. On the other hand, you have amateur chefs who are trying their hands at different things. So the overarching driver of taste has manifested itself, and we see two key themes which are emerging. On one hand, consumers are trying to recreate recipes and products which they would have had in cafes and restaurants in the comfort of their own home. Let's take the example of milk tea. So Nayuki, which is a milk tea maker, has launched a limited edition milk tea 5 liter bottle pack, which essentially is targeting those consumers who want their regular fix of milk tea but are still wary of stepping out and going to their local milk tea shop every single day. So Nayuki is bringing milk tea into the consumer's home and making it more accessible and easy for them to consume. The second theme that we see emerging is that of nostalgic flavors. So you have many different brands which are tapping into the need for old classic and nostalgic flavors. Here we've taken an example of a brand which launched an orange squash product to tap into the younger generation and their need for nostalgic products. And overall, we identified these themes by analyzing a total of 131 million consumer data points. Let's next dig down into the third driver, which is the consumers who are seeking convenience and ease of preparation. So as I mentioned, the COVID-19 pandemic has definitely made home chefs out of a lot of people. So a lot of brands are targeting amateur cooks or novice cooks and essentially launching a lot of products which are either ready to eat or easy to prepare and cook. Let me take the example of Heidi Lau, which they have modified their product offering to essentially launch many variants which of ready to eat semi finished meals which are targeting those novice cooks. The other challenge is that Heidi Lau had to overcome the fact that consuming hot pots typically tend to be a very social event with consumers sharing food, and they wanted to, and since consumers are still more cautious, they have modified their product offerings to bring Heidi Lau into the homes of the consumers. Next, looking at the third consumption driver, which is this need for natural and organic food. Now, this has manifested itself in different ways across categories. On one hand, you have products which are whole grain and multi-grain. For example, products launched on JD like rye and whole wheat snack and meal replacements, which are positioned as fitness foods. On the other hand, this broader theme for natural and organic food has also manifested itself in the beverages category with brands like Tongyang launching organic white fungus drinks. So there are many different brands which are tapping into this overarching need for food which is more natural and organic. And lastly, coming to our fifth consumption driver, or that of nutritious and nourishing food. So overall, there is definitely a need for food that is nutritious and nourishing. And we have a lot of products in the market which are tapping into this need. Let me take the example of Daily Fill, which has launched a cranberry drink. Cranberry as an ingredient is known to be rich in vitamin C, But they're also tapping into the need for wholesome nutrition by having other product claims as well, such as being sugar free and rich in nutrients. This overarching need for nutrition has also led to, of course, an increase and sustained in consumer interest for multivitamins and supplements on different e-commerce channels as well. Now that we've looked at the drivers, let's see how these shifting drivers have affected different product categories in the F&B space. So firstly, what we see is that there is a very strong demand for food that is fresh. And the Chinese consumer is definitely looking for food that is fresh. This manifests itself in an increase in consumer interest for fresh produce, fruits, and vegetables, and in particular, fruits and vegetables which have a very strong association with health. There are a few examples here on the screen. For instance, fruits like lychee, which is known to be rich in vitamin A and C, as well as berries like blueberry, have seen an increase in consumer interest. On the other hand, vegetables like balsam pear, pumpkin, and cauliflower, which again are associated as being healthy, have also seen an increase in consumer interest. Part of this, of course, is also driven by more home cooking. On the other hand, when we look at staples, the demand for staples like rice still continues to be strong, but there has been a shift. At the beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot of panic buying, which was when items which have a long shelf life had seen a significant increase. So that has come down to normal levels. So consumers are not necessarily preferring items with long shelf life anymore, probably driven by the fact that more and more consumers are ordering groceries online or going to their local grocery store to buy their food and beverages. Looking at the next category of products, let's look at immunity boosting foods. So here we see definitely a sustained consumer interest in immunity. And in particular, what we see is that products like, for instance, like gummy vitamins. So a lot of parents in China have relied on gummy vitamins, which has driven the increase in consumer interest significantly. It's increased by almost 277%. And this in particular is tied back to the fact that a lot of schools have opened in the duration since April onwards. Other immunity boosting ingredients which have shown a significant increase were like echinacea, which is a herb which is known to have medicinal properties, which has also shown a significant increase. Also, other products which are associated with immunity boosting, like green tea, ginseng, and variants of ginseng like red ginseng, have also shown an increase. Next, digging deeper into the overall topic of protein. So here what we see is that first let's start by looking at plant and fungi based protein. So we've analyzed a few brands in the plant based protein space, and they've shown some brands like Omnipork, Impossible Foods, and even local brands like Jinzi Ham have shown an increase in consumer interest. And we'll dig a little bit deeper as we go along in the presentation into what is really driving that increase in consumer interest. On the other hand, animal-based protein as well has demand has returned, especially as availability has improved. Consumers are not as frustrated by the lack of availability and the distribution channels anymore. You can see pork has increased significantly, and that is primarily driven by the fact that if you look at data in 2019, the demand for pork had dropped because of the African swine fever. So when we compare the 2020 data to 2019, it does show a significant increase. Next, looking at snacks and fast food. So overall, what we see here is that there is a preference for snacks which are healthy. So that has shown itself, that trend has manifested itself in an increase in consumer interest for nuts, seeds, and crackers. and more indulgent snacks like bread, cake, and chips have seen a little bit of a decline, which alludes to the fact that consumers are preferring healthy snacks. On the other hand, when we look at fast food restaurants, as the fast food restaurants, especially the burger chains, modified their business model to focus more on delivery, burgers have shown a little bit of an increase in consumer interest as well. Next, digging into dairy and the beverages category. So overall, what we see is that dairy has shown some increase in consumer interest, and that's a lot of it is driven by parents relying on dairy to help children build strength and immunity. On the other hand, you have a variety of healthy beverages like juices, smoothies, and green tea, which have shown an increase in consumer interest. Here we also see that other beverages, which are typically had in the context of socializing, like coffee and carbonated drinks, have also shown an increase, going back to how consumers are trying to recreate these recipes in the comfort of their own home. And also, part of it is driven by the fact that more and more restaurants and cafes have opened up since April. Next, let me walk you through some of the opportunities which are emerging in this context of the COVID-19 pandemic. And let's see how different brands and different stakeholders in the food and beverage space are tapping into these changes in behavior. So first, looking at protein, animal protein in particular. So here what we see is that there is a shift in where Chinese consumers are buying their meat, especially because the first and the second wave of the COVID-19 pandemic was traced back to wholesale food markets in Wuhan and Beijing. Because of this, consumers are still wary of their exposure to the virus while going out to these wholesale food markets. So that's why they're turning to e-commerce channels and online channels to buy their meat. And that's where we see e-commerce sites like JD, for instance, where the popularity for proteins like chicken and beef has really surged. Next, coming to the topic of plant-based items. When we look at this theme, what we see is that many different popular QSR chains have tapped into the emerging trend for plant-based products. I'll cover a few international chains here and then we'll go into the local players as well. So here you can see Starbucks has partnered with many different brands like Omnipork, Beyond Meat, and Oatly to launch a variety of plant-based products. These are everything from berries, oat milk, black tea shown here to Omnipork Vietnamese style noodle salad. So they're launching a wide range of plant-based products. On the other hand, chains like KFC have also launched plant-based chicken nuggets, particularly in tier 1 cities in China. In fact, here you can see that when they first launched the products, they had rebranded all their stores as green to announce the launch of these products. These are some of the international players. Next, digging into the local players. So many different local players also have entered into partnerships with some restaurants. Haiti, for instance, launched a plant-based burger. Sorry, Starfield launched a plant-based burger in collaboration with Haiti. At the same time, you also have other brands like Zen Meat, which is a local player, which is launching regional products like peppers, which is stuffed with plant meat, or vegan crayfish. So they're essentially making regional and local delicacies out of plant meat to cater to the Chinese consumers' tastes. We also had brands like Omnipork, which were tapping into this overarching demand and increase in consumer interest for plant-based food. At the same time, they also launched products like luncheon meat, which also tap into this need for nostalgic food and comfort food. So overall, what we see is that there has been an increase in consumer interest in plant-based items, especially since a lot of these products are newly launched in the market. The challenge will now be to sustain this consumer interest, uh, and see, and that's why we'll be keeping a close eye on how it will play out in the next few months. The last theme that I wanted to highlight is this decrease in consumer interest when it comes to imported or international food. A lot of it has been driven by the restrictions that the government placed on imports from different places like Australia, for instance, or Brazil, Canada, and Germany as well. So as trade tensions have been rising, and the government has placed restrictions on import of food from some of these countries in the context of COVID-19, that is showing up as a decline in consumer interest when it comes to imported food as well, at least in the short term. With that, we want to next dig a little bit into how the different regions in China have reacted to the COVID-19 pandemic, and how the patterns that we highlighted are manifesting themselves in different regions. This is really important because the different regions in China can be quite unique, and that's why we wanted to do a regional analysis and share that with you today as well. So firstly, we've considered 4 regions for this analysis: the area around Beijing, Shanghai, Guangdong, and Chongqing. So here what we see is that, unlike the last time we did this analysis where we looked at data from January to March, when we looked at data from January to July, most of the consumer needs are quite similar across these 4 regions. So overall, consumers are showing a preference for, on one hand, convenient food, but at the same time, food that is healthy, natural, and nutritious. The main difference is that when we looked at Guangdong, Guangdong was the only place where consumers are still are preferring taste over health. So they are relying on food to make them feel better. But overall, we see more similarities than differences when we see the 4 regions in China. Next, coming to some immunity boosting ingredients. So here overall, what we have seen is that garlic is very popular across the 4 regions in China, and even traditional Chinese medicine still continues to be popular. Traditional Chinese medicine is, of course, something that the Chinese consumers trust and they rely on it. So, which is why it is popular in all 4 regions. At the same time, vitamin supplements in particular are more popular in areas like Beijing and Chongqing, which were essentially more affected by the second wave of the virus. So with that, we come to the end of the insights that we wanted to share with you today. So overall, I will leave you with this parting thought. COVID-19 as a whole has had a lasting impact on how consumers behave and their preferences. And we see that consumers in China are definitely making more informed choices, but they're still cautious. And as we saw in the examples today, many different brands have already started tapping into this change in consumer behavior and modifying their product offerings to cater to these needs. What we will be doing in the rest of the series is that we'll be looking at ASEAN and India to see which of these emerging behaviors have had a lasting impact in those regions. Please do reach out if you want to know how you can use AI to spot trends or identify changes in real time. and understand consumer behavior as it is evolving in your category or your market of choice. With that, thank you so much for your attention today, and maybe we can open up the floor for questions.